everyone, this is Miss Braxton, and I'm coming to you with some notes on elections and campaigns, as well as really how does someone start by just being a normal candidate and running for office to getting into the seat of the presidency. So we're going to talk about the road to the ballot box. There are first some rules that you're going to have to remember about federal elections that are pretty much universal. The first one is that each state has its own elections or election laws and ballots. So basically, this is federalism in action. If you think about the fact that in some states, felons can vote, in some states, they actually send felons ballots to jail, like you can vote from jail in certain states. In other states, felons lose the right to vote for the rest of their life. And then you have states like Virginia that are somewhere in the middle where you can petition the governor, for example, to get your right to vote back if you're a felon. This also goes to things like voter ID laws and how we know that these vary drastically from state to state as well. So each state having its own election laws really does enforce this principle of federalism where states can do what they think works best for them and the people that live there, or what's best for them and the people who want to either gain or retain power. And the fact that states know, quote unquote, know what the people in their state need when it comes to running an election. There are some potential problems with this. For example, looking at the fact that each state has different ballots, like literal physical ballots, and that can sometimes lead to inconsistencies, and in really bad cases it can lead to issues that hold up the entire election. So thinking back to 2000, for example, all eyes were on the state of Florida because of this really confusing ballot system that they had. You would put it through the machine and it would punch a hole, and you can see here how the holes are pretty close to each other, and so what you got were hanging chads where the holes were punched in such a way that you didn't actually know who the vote was supposed to be cast for. This election was ended up in the Supreme Court, and they ended up deciding this election in favor of George Bush. But you can see how just one state's poor planning, poor whatever you want to call it, kind of led to this national crisis in an election. And we still have states that have issues from time to time, certain counties in certain states which are notorious for having election issues. And so that's another thing that is maybe not the best part about federalism, state by state. Some people think that, you know, it would be better if we just had a uniform system of voting for all states, but we do tend to think about elections as being that kind of reserved power because there is so little about the federal government's role in elections that are actually listed in the Constitution. Something that is listed in the Constitution, however, is the fact that we have regularly scheduled elections. So the Constitution says that Election Day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of even-numbered years. And yes, we do have a national election every other year in even years. However, in Virginia, you should be voting every single year because we have an election every year if you count state and local elections. Election Day this year is still the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, but we really think about this year as the last day to vote. Because of COVID-19, early voting and absentee voting has been expanded in ways that we really haven't seen before in the modern era. I cast my ballot in September. There are some states that have allowed widespread early voting or absentee ballots without an excuse, but this is the first year in Virginia that we've had early voting this early and that people have not needed an excuse to vote absentee. And so I wonder if, you know, maybe we'll see higher turnout because it's less restrictive. We know that Election Day on that Tuesday is really hard, especially for low income and working class people. So will turnout be higher this year because people are able to vote through a period of time? We won't know. But Election Day is still officially that first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. Although this year, that's really kind of like your last day to cast your ballot because we've seen this huge expansion of early voting. We have fixed, staggered, and sometimes limited terms. So fixed terms just means that there's a set amount of time that you're going to be in office before you have to go up for re-election. So The House, that term is 2 years. For the Senate, it's 6. For the president, it's 4. And we have staggered terms. And the idea behind staggered terms was that you would have a somewhat consistent Congress, right? Imagine if all of Congress were up for re-election at the same time and how unstable that might make our federal government or our legislature. So every member of the House is up for re-election at the same time every 2 years. So every 2 years, you're going to have a House election, and every single member of that House is going to be up for re-election. The Senate is a little bit different, though. So the Senate is far more staggered. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So the Senate is divided into 3 different classes. There's Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. This year, we have a Class 2 election. Our Senator Mark Warner is in Class 2, so he's up for re-election. Last election in 2018, it was Class 1 who was up for re-election, and Senator Tim Kaine is Class 1. So you do have different elections for different classes of senators, which just means when those senators are going to be up for re-election the next election that we have in 2022, it'll be Class 3. So we do have a somewhat stable legislature in terms of the Senate, because at any given time, you still have 2/3 of the same Senate left in power. And then term limits really only exist for the president. The House and the Senate, as long as you can keep being reelected, you can stay in office. There's no limit to the number of times that you can stay in office or be reelected. The president is a little bit different. He is limited to 2 terms of 4 years or 10 years total. So if you think about somebody who is a vice president, then something happens to the president in that president's second half of his term. That person could become the president for the last 2 years of the term of his president when he was vice president. So he can take those last 2 years and be president for those 2 years. And then he can run twice more for 4 years. So 2 + 4 + 4. Never thought you'd be doing math in AP Gov, but that's 10 years that someone could potentially be president. The next rule that we have gone over as a barrier to third parties is this winner-take-all rule. In America, we don't really care about the majority. The majority means 50% or more. I'm sorry, it actually means more than 50%. So if you get the majority of the vote, you get more than half. We don't care about that. In America, we have plurality elections, and this means that you just have to get more votes than everybody else. You don't gotta get more than half, you just have to get more than everyone else who's running. And if you do that, you get all of the electoral votes of one single state. So because of this, that's of course a barrier for third parties, because third parties rarely ever win more than everybody else who's running. So that makes a winner-take-all system for our presidential elections. We also have single member districts. So when we think about Congress and the number of, let's say Virginia has 11 districts in the state of Virginia. Well, there's only one representative for each of those districts. So when you're looking at who wins, it's the person with the plurality. There's only one person, so the person with the most votes gets that seat. There are other democracies, particularly in Europe, where they do things based on proportional representation. This means that, let's say for a presidential election, a state has 10 electoral votes. Let's say that you have a Democrat who wins 30% of the vote, a Republican who wins 60% of the vote, and an independent who wins 10% of the vote. Well, that Republican would then win all of the 10 electoral votes for that state. However, if we did things proportionately, if the Democrat won 30%, then they'd get 3 of the electoral votes. If the Republican won 60%, they would get 6 of those electoral votes. And if the independent won 10%, they would get 1 of those electoral votes. That would be things in a proportional way. We don't do that. With the exception of Maine and Nebraska, every other state has a winner-takes-all system for awarding their electoral votes. And the Electoral College is pretty hard to get rid of because it's written into the Constitution. So we would need an amendment if we wanted to fully get rid of the Electoral College as it is. Let's talk a little bit more about the Electoral College. There are 538 electors in the Electoral College. That's just the name for those people who actually do the choosing of the president and vice president. The way that it works is that every state gets a certain number of electoral votes, and these votes are based on the number of representatives that they have in the House, plus the number of senators. For example, in Virginia, we have 11 representatives in the House, and we have 2 senators. Therefore, we have 13 altogether electoral votes. So states that are larger will inevitably get more electoral votes. The thing is that every state has to have at least 3, and there can only be 538 electors. All of the states have a winner-take-all system except for Maine and Nebraska. So again, as long as that candidate gets more than the other person who they're running against, they get all of the electors for that entire state. And you can think of this as a game. The magic number is 270, 270 to win. So as long as a person makes it to 270 electoral votes, that means that they are president now. They have reached the number that they need to win the presidency. So every person is trying to get to that magic number of 270 electoral votes. Here are some fun facts about the Electoral College. And you probably know this, but we have had, in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections, the Democratic candidate has won the popular vote, but has only become president in 4 of the last 7 elections. This is because the Electoral College in the modern age heavily favors Republicans because of flyover states that have fewer people in them, so they have less electoral votes, but those are heavily weighted. So for example, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming. Wyoming is the least populated state in America, but it still has to have at least 3 electoral votes. Then you have a state like California, which has millions and millions and millions of people in it. Wyoming, 1 vote in Wyoming counts for 3.5% or 3.5 times a vote in California. So basically 3.5 people would have to vote in California in order to equal 1 vote in Wyoming, because that is how proportional the votes are to the number of people in those states. So you have a popular vote that doesn't really matter because the Electoral College makes it moot. And it's based on the fact that you have to give even the least populated states a minimum number of votes. So those states are really weighted much more heavily. And they're not super competitive states either. They're these flyover states in the center of the country that are pretty reliably Republican. And that is how this has really only favored Republican candidates in the last few years. Or actually every time that we've had a candidate who has lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, it has been a Republican. And we have to go back to thinking about the Electoral College and why it was created. Yes, we know that it was created because people didn't trust, or our founders didn't really trust the average man to cast ballots, but the way that votes are awarded was really to satisfy Southern slave states. Remember that when we were trying to decide how representation would work, the people in the South realized that if representation was only like free white landowning men, then they would never win an election. So we came up with the 3/5, or they came up with the very disturbing 3/5 compromise, which kind of gave the South disproportionate representation in the Electoral College, which really went on to benefit them even more after slaves were freed, because they were able to suppress the Black vote in these states. And you ended up with Black people who now counted as 5/5 of a person, but yet did not enjoy the same rights as everybody else, adding to this count in the states, so that these states were, getting all of the electoral votes. And there's a reason why, 7 of our presidents, most of them coming from earlier in our nation's founding, were from Virginia. And it is because the South had so many slaves, and was really, the Electoral College was helping them when it comes to representation. And even today, the Electoral College still disproportionately represents the white vote, in part because of what I talked about before with these flyover states. So a Hispanic vote is worth only 91% of a white vote, and this is because of where people live, right? the Black vote is worth only 95% of a white vote, and an Asian vote is worth only 98% of a white vote. So white people in these middle states of the country, those flyover states that have those electoral votes, even though they are less populated, most of the people who live in those states demographically are white. So they have more voting power than people of color in other more populated states. There's more about this in the notes for these, in the comments for these notes if you'd like to read more. Also, because of the Electoral College, the majority of campaigning only happens in 7 or 8 swing states. So this idea that the Electoral College makes it so that, people have to campaign everywhere, and, if we went with the popular vote, then people would only campaign in the coastal states. Well, people are already only campaigning in certain states. In the last election, 2/3 of the general election campaign events were only in 6 states. And you can see that here. So candidates aren't necessarily campaigning in everywhere, right? If you look here, if you live in Pennsylvania or Ohio or North Carolina or Florida, you are getting significantly more attention than the rest of the country. These are where all of those campaign events and stops were. So you can see that the Electoral College has really made it so that swing states have so much power in an election, and that people and candidates are really only catering to a handful of states in our country. So let's talk about how this whole entire process works. There are 4 different stages to this, and we're going to go through them one by one. The first stage are caucuses. So caucuses do not happen in the state of Virginia. I think there's only 6 states. Yep, there are only 6 states who actually have caucuses. And you can think of a caucus as like a closed door meeting. They're really fun to watch on TV if you ever get the chance. Sometimes they happen in someone's house. Sometimes they happen in ballrooms of hotels. Sometimes they happen in schools, in a cafeteria, or in classrooms. And this is how the people of a party, let's say the Democratic or the Republican Party in a certain state, they get together and they cast their votes. They're not really votes. It's really kind of like you raise your hand, and then some people stand on one side, and you really try to get a consensus about, in that group, who the party's choice should be for that presidential candidate. And again, we only have 6 states who do this. The Iowa caucuses are the first, and many people say the most important of all caucuses. Iowa is not particularly representative of the entire country. It's heavily white in comparison to the rest of the country, and it only has 6 electoral votes. But we see the Iowa caucus as being really important to starting that momentum. There's a really big pattern of candidates who win the Iowa caucus going on to win the nomination for their party. And so people see the Iowa caucus, because it is the first really big electoral vote, as key to winning, because it starts that momentum. It gets people excited about whoever can win it, and candidates put a lot of effort into the state of Iowa to try to win the Iowa caucus for their party. States that do not have caucuses have primaries, and this is what we have in Virginia. So a primary is truly just an election. It's a special election where voters get to select the candidate that they want to be their party's nominee for president in the general election. And primary season goes on for quite some time. It starts in February and doesn't end until June. So most of the time, the state party organization, so the Democratic Party of Virginia or the Republican Party of Virginia, will decide the rules for the primary in that state. It's really, really, really heavily run by the parties themselves. And there are 2 kinds of primaries. There are closed primaries, that's one kind. And this means that voters in a closed primary have to be registered to be in that party. So for example, you have to be a registered Republican in order to vote in a Republican primary in a state that has a closed primary. Or you have to be a registered Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary in a state with a closed primary. Independents really do not like these. Bernie Sanders has come out a lot against these because a lot of people who support Bernie Sanders in certain states are not registered Democrats. They're independent, but they can't vote for him because they're not registered Democrats. So if he runs on the Democratic ticket, which he has been, it is hard for people who support him to go and vote for him in that primary to make Bernie Sanders the Democratic candidate. You also have issues, I don't know if you guys remember way back in 2016, but New York, for example, is a state with a closed primary. And in New York, Donald Trump's own kids could not vote for him because they were not registered Republicans. So closed primaries really do kind of protect parties from having people from outside of that party voting for a candidate, but it also does cause some problems and is arguably less democratic because less people can vote because not everybody is registered for a party. In Virginia, however, we have open primaries. So if you are registered to vote, you know nobody asked you to register as a Republican or a Democrat in the state of Virginia. And we have open primaries. So when you go in, they just ask you what ballot you want. You only get one ballot. You can't vote for the Republican and the Democrat, but you can ask for the Democratic ballot and vote for that person or the person that you want to be the Democratic nominee. Or you can request the Republican ballot and vote for the Republican. So it doesn't really matter what party you're in. You only get one person, you only get that one ballot. And yes, independents do tend to favor these kinds of elections because it means that anybody can vote for them. Front-loading primaries. This is something that states try to do, and when we say front-loading, it is basically the idea that states really want to have their primaries towards the beginning of primary season because they know that that will give them greater influence in the nomination process. The earlier that your state goes, the more that people will pay attention to what's going on. By the time June comes along and California is having their primary, you pretty much already know who the candidate is going to be for either party. So because of this, about 70% of primaries and caucuses occur before the end of March. People really try to get those primaries in earlier and earlier. And New Hampshire is always the first state to have their primary. So New Hampshire, it's just their thing. They're always first. And so again, you know that having your primary earlier means that people are going to campaign more in your state. They're going to try to tell people of your state what they're going to do for them. And, they're going to try to really make stops and visits to your state. It puts your state on the map and makes candidates really care about what the people in your state do or what they think or what they need. So front-loading primaries is a phenomenon that happens, really everybody trying to get their primaries in, typically before April. The next stage after you have your primary is the party nominating convention. I definitely suggest that you try to go to one of these if you ever get the chance for whatever your party is. It can be a lot of fun. So basically, during election years, right after the primaries, when you know who your nominee is going to be, what happens is there's basically like a huge party of the who's who of each party, and you can even sign up to be a delegate. So basically, there are delegates. They come to the convention. It's either the DNC for the Democrats or the RNC for the Republicans. And they adopt a party platform. So these are the things that they're going to focus on for the next 4 years. These are issues that they're going to focus on to try to get people to vote for their candidate. It is where their party stands on major issues that voters care about. So they think about the platform of their party, and then the delegates elect the party's nominee for the president and vice president. So each state has a certain number of delegates. Kind of like the Electoral College, but we'll talk about some differences in a second. Each state has a certain number of delegates, and those delegates can go, and once they're at the convention, they will vote the way that their state voted in order to officially nominate that party's candidate. Now, there are two different kinds of systems for this. We talked already about winner take all versus proportional. So the Democrats do things the proportional way. This is what they do. Let's say a state has 100 delegates and Bernie Sanders gets 40%, then he would get 40 of those delegates. Let's say Joe Biden gets the other 60%, then he would get the other 60 delegates for that state. Republicans use the winner-take-all system, which is much more similar to the way that our country works for the actual presidential election. So again, if, I don't know who, let's going back to 2016, if Marco Rubio got 30% of a state's and, Donald Trump got the other 70%, then Donald Trump would win all 100 of that state's votes. So the parties do things differently with their delegate selections. Democrats have things called superdelegates. These were in the news a lot because Bernie Sanders hated them. So Democrats have pledged delegates who have to vote the way of their state. And then they have superdelegates who are basically like party leadership, party elites, people who have who are really kind of like establishment party people who can cast their ballots or their votes however they want to. This is basically, you know, a way for Democrats to ensure that the person that they think is going to actually win, maybe people who are more informed about the process or more informed about candidates, have a greater say in what's going on. Bernie Sanders hated superdelegates. He felt like they were the reason that he didn't win. In reality, I think he lost the pledge delegate vote as well back in 2016. But you know, there was a really huge push for reform in the party against superdelegates. At the same time, in 2016, a lot of Republicans were kind of lamenting that they didn't have superdelegates. Republicans who didn't like Donald Trump were thinking, okay, if the Republican Party had just had superdelegates, then they could have come in and swung the vote, you know, for someone else. Again, that's just kind of the way that superdelegates work. It could be a good thing or a bad thing. Again, pledged delegates, they're chosen at the state and local level. They have to vote for the candidate who won the popular vote. You can be a superdelegate as long as you're 18. You should definitely, I have a friend who is a pledged delegate for the Republican Party in DC. She really has a lot of fun every year when she goes. And then superdelegates, again, these are members of the establishment. They're unpledged. They can vote for whoever they want at the convention. And then we move into the general election. So it's what we call the battle for the center. We know that, you know, during primaries, Democrats and Republicans try to be as pure as possible, right? They're trying to be maybe like the most liberal Democrat or something, or the most conservative Republican, really, really playing into what their party wants. But then as the election actually starts, once they're the nominee, they do tend, in most cases, to try to move to the center to appeal to independent voters and undecided voters so that they don't seem too radical and can pick up votes outside of just those in their party. And you've got the Electoral College, which is what it really all is about. That's what it's all about. People trying to get to 270 because you know that once you get 270, you can win. And I think that covers it all. Hopefully this was helpful.